Okay, I think we're live. I'm Madison Bell. I too come from a shithole country, one whose elected head of state makes such aspersions about our neighboring countries. You could hardly imagine a more excremental cavity than that. But the United States has a record of being able to clean its own house. The situation is ours to change. Let's do it. A sign of the really high quality of this conference is that I've had to keep updating my talk throughout, not to mention my thinking. I don't really mind the trouble. Jamaica Kincaid told us the other night that enslaved peoples have freedom as their goal. Only after winning freedom can they have the pursuit of happiness as a goal. And these 2 points, freedom and happiness, define a line, maybe even a sort of progressive teleological arrow. I suggest adding a third, simple survival, which is apt to have priority over either freedom or the pursuit of happiness. And at that point, I was really going to avoid saying at that point. Now, we have 3 points from which triangles, circles, or spirals might perhaps be derived. And I could turn this whole thing into a geometry lesson at this point, but my understanding of geometry is actually quite poor, so I'm not going to do that. It's all the geometry you're going to hear. But since at this hour decent God-fearing people would be in church, I'm going to talk a little bit about religion and suggest that individuals espouse many different religions for 2 fundamental reasons and no order of priority first to assure survival and relative well-being for themselves and their descendants, and to satisfy certain cravings of a psyche whose origins may be inexplicable. Taking myself as an example, I was born with a mystical disposition which has permitted me to be serially captivated by Santa Claus, High Church Episcopalianism, the faith in which I was faintly raised, Roman Catholicism as interpreted by Graham Greene, Eastern Orthodox Christianity in the Russian variation, Islam in the Sufi variations, Renaissance Hermeticism as announced by Giordano Bruno, and after being long tossed about, Haitian voodoo and Quakerism, both of which I currently practice in the conviction that there is no difference between them other than superficial forms of expression. I'm totally serious about that. Autrement dit, there is no God but God has a whole lot more than 99 names, and one of their functions is to comfort us and gather us to their bosom when the end of the world is nigh. For about half of this country, the trumpets of apocalypse sounded with the election of Barack Obama to our presidency some years ago. For the other half, it was the election of the guy who tweets every day. This stupid polarization has paralyzed us in the face of a much deeper and more serious end-of-the-world threat, a 2-fold storm composed of climate change, which won't go away for being denied, and global overpopulation, which, thanks to unintended consequences of globalization, will no longer stay in its box. Apocalyptic threat has been with us for a little longer than my whole lifetime, or that's the way I perceive it. I think people older than me might say exactly the same thing. I don't know. For the first 30-odd years, it was represented by the prospect of nuclear annihilation, which, by the way, is now with us again. But I am of an age to have done those absurd duck and cover drills in elementary school. Some of you may have too. I don't remember that it really worried me at the time. I was too little, to process it. But in the mid-1980s, I was living in London and having a drink with a friend who I hadn't seen for quite a while. I pulled a bottle of Stolichnaya out of the freezer and offered him a shot, which he accepted. He looked at the bottle for a minute or two and said, "I used to drink a fifth of this every day." I suggested that that was rather a lot, and he agreed that it was. He had been depressed, he said. He had been in France working for an anti-nuclear group which employed the somewhat unusual tactic of going door to door, trying to convince whoever they met that they actually already believed that they were doomed to die in a nuclear holocaust, but just weren't thinking about it, that they had simply repressed this belief, refusing to acknowledge it consciously. I agreed it would probably depress a person quite a bit to go around proselytizing such an idea full time. Yes, my friend said. He knocked back his shot, poured out another one. And it's true, too, but now I don't think about it. For the worriers, with the apparent end of a Cold War at the end of the 80s, attention began to turn to other doomsday scenarios. Once a speedy global suicide by means of nuclear weapons seemed less probable, the probability of global suicide by slow poisoning moved into the limelight. At that time, I happened to be studying Bruno's 16th century presentation of Hermeticism, a variation on Neoplatonism based on an assumption of universal animism, which proposes that all objects on Earth and in the universe are alive and in some way even sentient, engaged in a living relationship with one another. This idea is a reversal of the more familiar Neoplatonic pessimism about matter as a dead linkage of chain that binds the human spirit and prevents it from realizing its divine potential. If you missed any of that, it's okay, it's not really important. In the Hermetic scheme of things, all material objects are really beings capable of pointing the way of return to the divine sphere whence the human spirit first descended voluntarily. The Judeo-Christian fall is conceived less as a catastrophe than as a deliberate act of love, a sexual act between humans and nature, humanity's response to the life inherent of every aspect of the created world. For Giordano Bruno, the world-destroying threat was religious warfare, which during his time went on for decades at a stretch, decimating European populations, because, as he saw it, Christendom had gone astray and begun to use force instead of love. He was certainly right about that part. A return to the original formula should solve the whole problem. Bruno was thus a religious reformer, a dangerous vocation at the time. His belief system included the idea that the figure of Christ is simply an example rather than a unique case of the realization of the divine potential shared by all human beings. Anyone with the proper training and determination could acquire all of Christ's miraculous power, for example. Bruno scurried all over Europe, doing his best to convey this good news to various heads of state, until the Inquisition caught up with him and burned him and tortured him to death. He ended up being burned at the stake, but a lot of bad things happened before that. If Bruno's Hermeticism seems both exotic and antique, I can say that its core ideas are still with us. Both Quakerism and Haitian voodoo, with some difference of detail, I admit, find in every person a spark of divinity which can be fanned to flame. Both these religions, and we might as well include our Pentecostal churches too, set out to bring the Holy Spirit into the flesh, that is, literally to incarnate it. In Haitian voodoo, such manifestations occur regularly and often in the form of spirit possession. In Haitian culture, more generally, spiritual events are apt to have the same reality status as any other kind of event, with no distinction drawn between them. Universal animism, a concept shared by almost all the cultures that we in the first world have been pleased to call primitive, finds that same spark of divinity in the world and everything in it, which leads to the insight that the world itself is the body of God. In 1990, that insight appeared to me as a redeeming revelation because it seemed possible to connect it to a much more recent system of thought, something called the Gaia hypothesis, which emerged from work done by James Lovelock beginning 30 years before that in the 1960s. Bruno was a renegade monk. Lovelock was a renegade scientist. From a 1960s project to try to create chemical tests to figure out whether or not there was life on Mars, he evolved a theory that, quoting him, the entire range of living matter on Earth, from whales to viruses, from oaks to algae, could be regarded as a single living entity, capable of manipulating Earth's atmosphere to suit its own needs and endowed with faculties and powers far beyond those of its constituent parts, that is, universal animism expressed in 20th century scientific terms. Lovelock, I'm sure, had no intention to become a New Age prophet, but the Gaia hypothesis made an obvious appeal to the New Age zest for holism that bloomed circa 1990 as, Lovelock again, an alternative to that pessimistic view which sees nature as a primitive force to be subdued and conquered. It is also an alternative to that equally depressing picture of our planet as a demented spaceship, forever traveling, driverless and purposeless, around an inner circle of the sun. Lovelock was careful to stop short of talking of Gaia as though she were known to be sentient, but this very language makes the animist intention of his theory unmistakable. I'm going to summarize just a little bit of my text in the interest of time. Lovelock wasn't an ecological doomsayer because his theory, the way the world operated, was considered to be a self-regulating organism that would work out its own homeostasis. So there was that limited the damage that human beings could do to it. Although, from his scientific remove, he did say, and I guess I will quote this for it. Yes, life on this planet is a very tough, robust, and adaptable entity, and we are but a small part of it. Large plants and large animals are relatively unimportant. So he could foresee changes such as the one that's going on right now, and as a result of which many species, I'm quoting him again, including man, would be discomforted, and some would be destroyed. So you can take all the comfort from that you can. It's hard to imagine a universe that doesn't have without us in it, or that really just doesn't revolve around us in every possible way. There's a new school of thought called post-humanism, but I think I'm too old to figure that one out. But in 1990, I thought, I can save the world, and here's how. I'm going to fuse the Lovelock's ideas about Gaia with emerging New Age mysticism and create a brand new fantasy mythology, a reformed religion that would be capable of saving the planet and saving humanity from itself. Okay? Any takers? Right? Back then, okay, one, yeah. Okay, let's start a movement. There weren't a lot back then either. I mean, I was really late, with hindsight, not to plagiarize from Robert Antoni, I realized I was crazy as Giordano Bruno, but by dumb luck, there was no inquisition after me. My worst risk was to be laughed out of the room. And it wasn't only my delusions that failed to come to pass. If you didn't notice or think about it, the New Age never happened. The whole fragile sphere of its ideation disappeared like so much dandelion seed on the wind, only without landing, taking root, and producing any more dandelions. I'm going to avail myself of some of this water. A commodity that we're going to run out of before too long, but we'll still have the plastic. So 30 years on, those threats to our survival have only become more acute, or maybe we are just more acutely aware of them. So here we are. Wait a second. This is that. There we go. Okay. That's where we are right now in Florida. I know this map doesn't look all that contemporary, but I think there are some ways that I can make it relevant to our time. The image is centered on what's lately been called the Old Atlantic world, somewhere near the peak of colonization and its pernicious fellow traveler, the slave trade. I was interested to learn yesterday that Teju Cole considers this body of water with its shores to be his continent, as he put it. That makes a weird kind of sense, actually. If you look closely, and I think it's actually hard to see even with the thing blown up, so I'm simply going to ask you to believe me on the point that the center of the emerging spiral is the island of Hispaniola. And I should say, too, that the image is cover art for Kayama Glover's Haiti Unbound. It's a brilliant work on spiritualism. The artist is her husband, Stéphane Volter. Glover's subject is a mostly literary Haitian movement starring René Philoctet, Jean-Claude Fignolet, and Franck Etienne. There were a few things said about it in another panel, but I'm going to talk about it in a slightly different way. These writers conceived spiritualism in the 1960s as an oblique way of telling the truth without risking fatal reprisal from the totalitarian de Valériste state, but the implications are deeper. Haitian intellectuals are redoubtable for a number of reasons. They build directly on the base of the 18th century French Enlightenment, which was crystallized in the educational system by the Haitian Revolution and continues to be the essential content of a good Haitian high school education to this day. On top of that are layers of university education often undertaken abroad, but Haitian intellectuals tend to be immune to the narrow specializations that fracture postgraduate study in the first world. They are Renaissance people. It is normal for a Haitian intellectual to be an anthropologist, a chemist, medical doctor, an agronome, as well as being a writer and visual artist. Nobody thinks that's weird. They may be Ungo or Mambo as well, for beneath all these strata of European acculturation is an African sensibility which can be accessed at any time and whose potencies are very different from the European. Hispaniola is the great historical crossroads where European, Native American, and African peoples collided for the first time. The idea of African slavery originated here in the mind of a conquistador turned priest, Bartolomé de las Casas. It's worth a mention that Las Casas' intentions were humanitarian in their way. He had a sincere affection for the indigenous people of the island they themselves called Haiti. He saw that they could not survive the conditions of slavery imposed on them by his countrymen and thought maybe the tougher, more durable Africans could be substituted for them. Of course, only half of this plan worked. The extermination of Taino people was not halted or much delayed, but African slavery succeeded beyond Las Casas' wildest imagining, repopulating Hispaniola, the Caribbean basin, and much of the two American continents. So you have this, you can read this image as an image of that population movement that derives from the 17th and 18th century slave triangle. The Africans, I presume, not being one of them, but I'm just going to take the risk of saying that they would not have called slavery a success. In Haiti, especially, resistance was constant and took many forms, eventually that of a revolution that created an independent black nation. Before the Haitian Revolution, and in some ways underwriting it, was marronage. Hispaniola's mountainous terrain facilitated both escape and remaining at large. Maroons in the mountains commingled with the last vestiges of Taino people hiding out there. By the time of the revolution even, this Native American bloodline was indistinguishable, but it retains its mythological importance to this day. To some degree, there was a combination of cultures, and some Taino religious practices descended into Haitian voodoo. Can you make that go away? I don't even care if thank you. And this talk was sponsored by Apple. Thanks. By the time of the revolution, right, to some degree, there was a combination of cultures, and some Taino, I said that part too. The tradition of resistance to European power in all its forms contains a small Taino component. Maroon communities in Haiti constituted pockets of independence before independence. Some were large and powerful enough to have their freedom formally recognized by treaty, as also happened in Jamaica. Maroon communities preserved African military practices, which were deployed in the revolution as an alternative to European military systems instituted in the growing Haitian armies by Toussaint Louverture. Maroon attacks and retreats were indirect, oblique, and spiraling. Fighters whirled off into the mountains and survived to fight another day. And forms of marronage have persisted through the 19th and 20th centuries into the 21st. Marronage, as practiced today, means, it can mean more than this, but this is a thing that it means, abdication from conventional pressures of all kinds, but particularly from the rectilinear organization of European thought. Literary spiritualism is a special case of this phenomenon. The Haitian foundation myth shares some plausibility problems with the creation story in Genesis. It reports that people from dozens of different tribes and traditions all over West Africa who found themselves enslaved in French Saint-Domingue came together one night in 1791 at Bois-Caïmont, had a tremendous ceremony, and walked away at dawn with a new religion, voodoo, common to all, a new language, Creole, understood by all, and a new revolutionary commitment, shared by all. It's an efficient way of communicating a process that, like creation, had to have taken longer than that. The point is that one way or another, it did happen. A unified Haitian people emerged in possession of a cohesive shared culture alternative to the one imposed by Europeans, proving, as Haitian novelist Yannick Lance recently put it, that people can inhabit the world in a different way. So the crossroad is here, a spiritual as well as historical crossroad in French Carrefour, in Creole Carrefour, controlled by Legba, close cousin of the Greek Hermes, master of changes, or in times of violence and danger by Legba's more sinister alter ego, Met Carrefour, the master of the crossroads and at times the director of whirlwinds. Possession crisis in large voodoo ceremonies takes the form of a tourbillon. The dancers spiral in on a single point, locus of the old brain structures at the base of a single skull, creating such pressure that the individual consciousness is temporarily dislodged and spirit, incarnate, rises up in its place. The same spiral is found inside the conch shells, which Maroons used as trumpets to signal each other. The conch shell remains a constant symbol of marronage. From the spiral form of the nautilus, the golden mean can also be extracted. In this context, it's a generative form. When it's a hurricane, not so much. And I have a couple of paragraphs about that, but you know what? We're in Florida. You know that there were like 4 hurricanes in the Caribbean this season, what damage they did. I think I will just mention that along with Puerto Rico, the island of Dominica was almost completely destroyed. Dominica is a tiny little island between Martinique and Guadeloupe. It no longer belongs to any large world power, so no one pays much attention to bad things happening there. The damage done in Haiti didn't get much press either because natural disasters in Haiti have become routine. So there we are. I'm going to move ahead to the second part of the topic, which is about global population. And in the panel yesterday, Brent Hayes-Edward asked the question, where are the boundaries of the Caribbean? And if you, well, I think you can look at this image as an answer to that question. There ain't no boundaries. It's the whole world. So I'm going to ask you to think of this design as an image of human flow, which is the title of Ai Weiwei's recent documentary. Of this phenomenon, Haiti has also been a crossroad. Haiti's heroic heritage is usually ignored by first world reportage, which prefers to present it as the poorest country in the Western Hemisphere. You know, that's always like the lead. And Haiti, the poorest country, blah, blah. But without saying outright or even figuring it out, I suspect, that the dire aspects of Haiti's situation represent where all the other countries are apt to end up. There's a lot more to Haiti than poverty and desperation, as I've tried to suggest, but the poverty and desperation of Haiti show the consequence of absolutely ruthless exploitation of all resources, natural and human, compounded by exponentially increasing overpopulation. So refugee crises experienced in Florida often start in Haiti, where political conditions oscillate between tolerable and not, while exhaustion of resources gets progressively worse, thanks in part to political instability. And Floridian crises matter nationwide because of Florida's importance in presidential elections, which refugee influxes from Haiti have affected a couple of those, so it matters in the most cynical way. You can say that these population movements matter to everybody in this room at least a little bit, no matter where you came from to get here to Florida. So we can rethink this graphic as an image of refugee movement in our time. Well, I want to say that on a larger scale, Haiti, in this particular context, Haiti is like, we think of it as being backward, but it's actually ahead of us politically in terms of resolving its race problem, and less happily in being a forerunner case, an example of what happens when a people in a place run out of everything and have to go somewhere else. So we can rethink this graphic as an image of refugee movement in our time, a modeling of human flow, and let's see. Oh, here we go. So if you look, this is the North African coast, if you can see, and the movement that everybody's paying attention to now began there and was caused by the collapse of or destabilization of North African coastal dictatorships. But if it didn't happen for that reason, it was going to happen for some other reason. In fact, it has been happening for 30 years or longer, just on a more manageable scale than what we've seen in the last few years. A thing this seismic demographic shift means is that the heirs of Western Europe, who have spent many centuries at the top of the food chain, are not going to be able to stay there, not on either continent. Such a major redistribution of people must lead to a major redistribution of resources. That process is as irresistible as the climate change effects we will continue to experience at the same time. There are reactionary movements underway here and in the UK, and less successfully in France. In the long run, they will make no difference. Britain can never again be the sort of island it once was. No Great Wall of Mexico will stem the flow into this country, nor will any other measures. Demographic pressures are too vast. Now, I don't have a visual for the last image that I want to show you, so I have to produce it out of words, but after all, that's supposed to be like what I do, so I'm going to I'm going to try to make it happen, but as usual, as in novel reading, poetry reading, and hypnosis, it requires a willing suspension of some of your conscious processes. this is an image from, some of you may have seen Ai Weiwei's Human Flow, but which is very kind of sound as a documentary piece of reportage, although its methods are a little unusual. There's not a lot of words in it, but it's the work of an artist, not a reporter. So the whole film is designed very powerfully around artistic imagery rather than reportorial narrative. And so I'm gonna try to reproduce for you what I consider to be the central structural image, and also probably the chief carrier of meaning in this film, which is a long moving shot whose first phase produces a near hallucinatory spatial confusion in the mind of the observer. I've already achieved this, see. No, because what I was honestly going to do was propose that you roll your eyes up to the top of your head and then close the lids of your eyes, but without letting your eyeballs come back down. Then let your eyeballs come back down, and this is going to facilitate the visualization. Okay, everybody there? Thank you. We seem to be looking at a white wall with regular rectangular indentations in it. These have a bluish cast. They might be window embrasures. As the camera dollies in, we see the embrasures in more detail and realize that, in fact, they are roofs of temporary shelters in a refugee camp. Space rotates dizzyingly as our antique brain structures process the fact that the camera is not moving horizontally, but descending. In a crossroad formed by 4 shelters at the center of the frame, there are people, many of them, moving at first at random in a sort of Brownian motion often repeated in other shots of crowd movement in the film, but this time organizing itself into a perfect circle around the center point implied by the camera's descent. By now, we can no longer see the shelter roofs, and next, the circle of people also disappears as the camera rushes toward the final crossroad defined by the intersection of 4 tiles in the pavement. Cut. I will say that all images from great art are essentially irreducible and resistant to paraphrase, but one interpretation of this one is that we are flying ourselves into the ground. I think we have time we got like 6 minutes, right? If anybody has a question? If you don't have a question, okay, I see somebody.
Hi, Daria and I are from the island of Dominica, and we are going back to Dominica. I would just like to point out an acute example of human flow. It's an island with a population of 65,000 people. They tell us that after Hurricane Maria, 30,000 people left the island.
I'm not going to complain about that not being a question. Thank you. No, I'm kidding. Thank you. The point is very well made.
I'm still stuck on spiralism. Could you say more?
Spiralism?
Why do you say it that way?
Because it's French. I mean, it comes out of the French. I mean, I am really not an expert on it. If you want to really understand the kind of literary, if you want to understand it thoroughly, Kayama Glover's book Haiti Unbound you should get that and read it. I mean, it was the way I see it. It was a response, probably first of all, to repression by the devaluer state. People, the artists and writers of Haiti needed to find a way to speak that would elude censorship by kind of constantly, sort of curving around dangerous subjects in this spiral form. And then it does have all these roots in the interior form of the conch shell, which is a symbol, like the official iconic symbol is of marronage in Haiti is the conch shell, which the pre-revolutionary marron used as trumpets to signal each other, and then all those ideas that come out of marronage in the 20th and 21st century marronage, which implies resistance to imposed systems of thought.
Hi, I've seen spirit possessions in India and Africa, and also in churches in Harlem. I haven't seen any in Haiti, but I didn't spend enough time there. What is it that they all share in common in your mind? Spirit possessions happens all over the world in all animistic religions.
In all religions. You don't even have to say animistic. Every religion of the world has got a possession element in it somewhere. I mean, it may be way back in its history, but it's there. If you don't like Haitian voodoo, consider Saint Teresa. But so actually, I mean, there's a million different ways of possession. What possession experiences have in common is that the ego, which takes charge, kind of. In the first world, we basically operate on the assumption that our egos are our entire selves. This is not true. And the fact that we behave in that way is actually harmful not only to ourselves, but to anybody we interact with. And any possession experience dislodges the ego from its seat on the saddle of the self, thus freeing the being of the possessed person from the prison of the self. They all do that. The techniques for inducing that experience are just wildly various. And so I was describing in the talk, in big Haitian voodoo ceremonies, there tends to be this kind of spiral movement at the foot of the drums and a compression with a lot of people kind of pressing in on the one person whose ego finally gives way. And then they fall out, and loi arises in its place, and then the people there can interact with the spirit, which is one of their deities. So this is a great thing. It's a shame we've lost it in the first world. It's a hugely cathartic experience. Oh, we're out of time. Yeah. Okay. Thank you.